Welcome to the Happy in the Mess podcast. We are your hosts, Marlena, Sherry, and Matthew. We are therapists and coaches, and we want to share our own stories with you, as well as the wisdom, insights, and tips we've learned along the way. Thanks for tuning in to this episode.
Welcome, everyone, to the Happy in the Mess podcast. We are now in season 2. We can't believe that we're already here. If you have not checked out our previous episode of the year, it's a really great one to start off with. We talk about changing paths. And because with the new year, a lot of us are taking a new start. So make sure you listen to that episode and be sure to like, share, and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you know when our episodes come. They usually come in on Thursdays. We try to be on time. And we have with us today, as usual, Sherry Timko, our relationship coach, and Matthew Morgan, the Misfit coach. And we'd like to share just a couple of the offerings that they have right now. So you make sure you grab some free resources before we dive into today's episode, which is really wonderful. So stay tuned. Sherry, what do you got going on right now?
I have a relationship habit walkthrough so that you can. I just love this idea of like building in good habits into your relationship so you don't have to work so hard. So it's called Ho Hum to Hell Yes. And you can find it on my website at sherrytimco.com.
Oh, wonderful. That sounds really great. Thank you. And Matthew.
And we have a great misfit guide, which is really just kind of this ladder structure to understand what our gifts are, really ask some leading questions, and then how to apply those to some of our challenges. So that's at misfitrefuge.com. People can go there, just sign up. It's a freebie, so it'll be zapped out. We're not going to sell email or anything like that because we love spam as much as everybody else.
Yeah, I've
Not at
seen
all.
that. I've seen your handout and your guide, and it's really good.
It's
Thank you.
super thorough. It is
Yeah.
very thorough. And I'm Marlena. I'm a spiritual dating coach, and my soapbox is actually meditation. I feel like that is the way to transformation and manifestation. So I have a new 15-minute guided meditation. There's room for silence in there, really to help get you started. And also, just if you just need a little bit of a nudge, just sit down on your pillow and do it. So you can
Oh,
get that. Go
That's
ahead.
awesome. You are always talking about the meditation, and you know that's not my thing. So I love that you have a beginner's
Mhm.
meditation.
Yes, and I recorded it with a nice mic, so audio should be on point. It's called Everything is Working Out for Me, because I really do believe that when you start thinking everything is working out for you, things tend to go better. So you can grab that at coachmarlena.com/meditation 1800. It's a terrible thing. coachmarlena.com/meditation 1800. But anyway, or just DM me and I can send it to you. Anyhow, today we're going to be talking about post-traumatic growth. Some of you may not even know what that is, but we're going to dive into what that means. How is it different from PTSD and how we can make the most of it when we've gone through something really hard and how we can come out the other side stronger. So to begin with, let's start out with just describing what that means. What is post-traumatic growth?
All right. So I'm going to start a half a step back that post-traumatic stress is the reaction that a person has to a trauma. And everyone has a reaction, but not everyone has PTSD. PTSD is when that trauma sticks with you and it just keeps coming up again and again. So it might be flashbacks, it might be feeling disengaged or hypervigilant. There's a lot of different symptoms of it, but it's that trauma that just stays with you and you just can't release it. Matthew, do you want to add anything about the PTSD before we go to the growth?
No, yeah. One of the things that first jumped to mind, and I caught this from Frank Anderson, who does the IFS trainings, who's just an amazing human being. Also has some sort of amazing magic that makes him appear about 20 years younger. So I need to talk to him to figure that part out too. But with him, one of the things he talked about is that we all have some sort of trauma in our lives. Everybody in life will go through this. Really, what is a post-traumatic stress moment? And he said that nobody gets out for free with it, but the problem a lot of times comes with sequential things. And I think really what you're talking about here is this is one of those key moments is what do we do with that first trauma? Do we heal through it? Do we allow it to grow, or does it become a sticking point for us too?
Hmm. Thank you both for that sort of clarity on what that is. And I just wanted to add the clinical definition of trauma. People use that word a lot, and it's not always referring to what we call like the clinical definition, which is directly experiencing or witnessing actual or threatened death or sexual violence in some way. That does not mean that you can't have symptoms of PTSD after something else that was felt traumatic, but not all quote unquote traumas as I hear lay people talk about them fall in that category. Do you all have any comments on that, sort of the clinical definition of it and how other people, use that term?
Yeah. So one of the problems that people often bring to me is that their partner had an affair, and the reaction of the partner who was cheated on.
Yeah.
The reaction is so much like PTSD. Like
Mm.
like you have those flashbacks, you're ruminating on it, you can't let go of it, you're hyper vigilant, you're checking everything. So there are a lot of things that cause that same reaction, even if it doesn't fit that clinical definition.
That's really helpful. Thank you for sharing that. Sure, something like that would feel very traumatic and have very similar symptoms to that. That doesn't make it any less important, I guess is my point. It's still important, even if it does not qualified necessarily for that definition.
Yep, absolutely. And I think being tuned into the emotions is really what we're talking about here. What are we experiencing? How are we feeling this? The first thing that jumped to mind, and I'm going to go completely the opposite side of things, which was for those that watch football. Last Monday night for us, I don't know when people are listening to this, but all I'll have to do is mention the Bengals and the Buffalo Bills game when one of the Bills players, Damar Hamlin, went down and suffered a cardiac event in the middle of a field, and we watched 65 some thousand people in the stadiums go completely silent. All the announcers, networks for an hour and a half are trying to figure out what's going on. We don't know what to do with these moments. And I think that has a lot of it. It may not qualify for that direct experiencing of a trauma, but there was very much a vicarious experience of it. And watching everybody's emotions and watching how they processed it as a therapist was not how I planned on spending my Monday night. I usually like to watch football to blow off the steam from the day. And instead I found a lot of the therapist coach things re-engaged with that. But regardless of how we're experiencing, whether we experience it through a spouse or through other events or through virtual events or watching live events, it still creates a lot of these feelings within us that we have to decide what to do with, even if it may not qualify for a clinical definition.
Yeah, this brings us back to what we were talking about just before we started recording today, is that going through the pandemic really was traumatic for everyone on some level.
Mm-hmm. Well, we were exposed to news that people were dying and waiting in hospitals without getting care. And it was sort of like a mass sort of public trauma that we were all sometimes witnessing, sometimes experiencing. If you were the one waiting in the, waiting to get care, that was a very hard time. And really that's how come this podcast bloomed out of post-traumatic growth, essentially. This is
we are post-traumatic growth,
Yeah. So now that we know the difference between like the traumas, we know that different types of events can create post-traumatic stress symptoms. Can you go just a little bit more into, sure, you mentioned some of them, you may have flashbacks, hypervigilant, nightmares. What other types of kind of those distressing symptoms might show up if you've experienced something that you would consider traumatic?
Yeah, this reliving the experience. And not being able to let go of it. Your emotions are kind of all over the place and feel a little bit out of control and unpredictable.
Yeah.
Avoidance, I think, comes into play too here,
Sure.
where we always think about in terms of the positive or the engaged symptoms. But oftentimes with trauma, I think we avoid whatever it is. We don't want to look at it. We don't want to talk about it. If something comes up, we have this very visceral reaction. So we tend to push that all away.
Thank you for reminding me of that, because it isn't just avoidance of the trauma. Sometimes it's avoidance of everyone and everything and just really needing to shut down and not interact.
Right.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true. And then sometimes disassociation comes into play, just kind of feeling like you're not really in your body, you're not really present, kind of checking out. Yes, all symptoms. So I'm wondering, can you be experiencing these symptoms and then start to experience the growth? Or let's talk about now, what is the growth and how do we distinguish when we're getting there? If we're still experiencing, I don't know if that's even possible. Can you start to experience growth as you experience the distressing symptoms?
As a therapist coach, the post-traumatic growth is one of the most exciting things about my work, because it's seeing something positive come out of something that is negative or tragic. And just that going through a crisis requires you to grow and to learn new things and to experience the world differently. Now, we tend to think of PTSD as experiencing it in a worse way, but sometimes going through a trauma can help you let go of something that you were carrying around, or change some beliefs, or make some new connections with other people or with yourself. So that growth piece is the exciting part of it.
Something to look forward to if you've gone through a trauma or traumatic event.
Yeah.
Well, if you think about it in terms of everybody who's going back to the gym now that it's the brand new year, and we realize that we have been neglecting that side of our lives for the last 11 or so months. We're going back in there. Like, the whole concept of going to a gym is you really are pushing yourself, and you're breaking down muscles, you're breaking your testing your tendons, you're pushing your body to really limits that it hasn't gone before, and literally damaging yourself, but then allowing everything to heal in the process. And I think we can picture that physically, but trying to picture that emotionally, of just recognizing that these things break us down. Exactly what you were saying, Sherry, that idea of some increased awareness of things, as we learn what we can do, as we learn to lose things that we weren't meant to carry anyway, or things that were temporary. I think that's all signs of growth in this process. And they do happen simultaneously. I don't think it's a one phase or the other. I think it's a progression of these two things.
Ooh, I'm loving this topic because, okay, this really makes sense of pain and already starts to provide people like hope and meaning for whatever tragedy they've experienced or loss or whatever it is that's causing some trauma. But is that necessary for growth? I mean, is this the pathway to growth? Is breaking down and having some pain and experiencing trauma?
Oh, this is one of my favorite little soapbox issues, because I exist in the world of crisis in couples. And so they come to me at that moment when their relationship is blowing up or some tragic thing has happened. And it is an opportunity for a big pivot and to deal with stuff that was pre-existing. But in my heart, I wish that they would come see me 6 months to a year before that. And they could avoid most of the crises that happen with couples. So it's not necessary to have a crisis, but most people will wait for a crisis before they make those changes.
Yeah. I think it was Mark Twain who said, I'm going to mess up the quote, I think, a little bit, but the weakest of things is a virtue that is untested, which is actually from my college play that for some reason I remember, The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg. So a virtue that's not tested isn't one that's really a virtue. And I think, so is it the only path to growth? Maybe not, but it is certainly one, and it's a major one. And I think it's one that we go through, Sherry. Like you said, it almost becomes inevitable if we don't constantly maintain a system. There's going to be some breakdown there.
Well, this sort of harkens back to that previous episode where we talked about emotions. I think I mentioned that emotions being the guardrail, sort of letting us know, ooh, I feel a little out of alignment because now I'm feeling some irritation or some anger, and now I'm starting to feel some despair. Like our emotions are letting us know when we're getting off track, and then if we keep ignoring it, we go, those little side things on the highway that let us, the rumble strips, let us know when we're, and then if we keep ignoring it, we veer off. We veer off and we have an accident. And so that's sort of like what happens. Like there were signs, perhaps, Sherry, that these couples could have, and I see it with my clients too. There are signs that let you know you're off track, and you keep ignoring it, you keep ignoring it, and then there's a crisis.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And the crisis. So crisis is a wonderful opportunity.
Yes.
Now, I don't advocate going and finding a crisis to go through. But one of the things that happens when a couple is in recovery after an affair is that they often deal with the problems that pre-existed that affair. So they actually come out of that experience stronger and with a better relationship than they had in the past. And so there is that really, like, it a crisis gets your attention. It makes you look at that situation and makes you deal with it.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I think for misfits too, this is one of those things that we often, when we try to compare ourselves to everybody else, we try to, do I have the same outlook of things? Do I process things the same way? And in a normal environment, that and those things don't really, they're not advantageous. Okay, it's the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer thing, right? Like Rudolph's red nose is this completely worthless thing until Santa needs somebody to guide the sleigh. And yes, I've just gone from Mark Twain to Rudolph, and I'm sure I will segue into all sorts of other weird things because this is the way my brain works. But I think as people, we recognize during those times of stress, and when we find growth, that's when we find where we really are in this. What are my desires? What are my wants? What do I bring to this world? What's unique about me? And we can solve this problem in a way that's consistent with our virtues. And that develops a greater confidence. And I start to know who I am with that.
I love what you just said, because I feel like this is the clarity piece. Crisis brings also clarity of values, of what I want. And sometimes you don't know until you're confronted with something you absolutely do not want or like. And that is so valuable in moving forward. And so yeah, I tell my clients when they're struggling with something, I'm like, this is like, can we just recognize that this is actually a great moment, because now you understand fully what it is you want out of this relation or out of your dating life or whatever it is that we're working on. And before, when there might not have been, and so they weren't making choices in alignment with who they really are.
So I call these growth opportunities, maybe not the trauma part. And I have to admit, my husband and children hate it when I'm like, oh, you get a growth opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mom. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, speaking of this reframe, so we as therapists and coaches understand that these are growth opportunities. Like this is a wonderful opportunity to grow, to have clarity, which is priceless in my opinion, to make new choices so that you can create a new reality essentially. But how do we stay away from toxic positivity, and and what's the difference between, post-traumatic growth and recognizing when you are and understanding and almost appreciating that, and toxic positivity, or what we call spiritual bypassing, which is basically using spirituality and religion to kind of ignore the messy parts.
Can you give us some examples of that? That's a new term for me. Actually, maybe both of them. Positive. Positive toxic. I can't get it.
Toxic positivity, although positive toxicity might be interesting too. So,
I think both go. Well, Matthew, would you like to share on this?
I think with these, it's this idea that everything's all right. Like we just try to convince ourselves that everything is just fine. What stands out to me here, there's a different, as we encounter this stress environment, we have either an opportunity for growth or an opportunity to return to balance, right? So a homeostasis, right? And a toxic positivity is going to hold us in this homeostasis. It's going to hold us in this balance of things, right? I see it in spirituality, religion all the time. God had a reason for that, right? So don't be sad, don't be upset. Or the universe intended this, so you don't really have a right to catch it. And it's that second part that's really the problem, right? Because we have a right to our feelings.
Yes.
And I see it biblically, spiritually. There's a lot of spiritual ideas of light and dark being intertwined with each other. So it's this idea again, when we're toxic. Now I'm going to mess it up. When we have toxic positivity, we're just saying that everything's okay. We're just trying to restore this balance rather than trying to find the growth in this. I heard a fantastic sermon, and the real quick version of this is he would really ask the question like, how many of you want to go home and eat a cup of baking soda? And of course, everybody who bakes is like, no, thank you. That stuff's bitter. It's nasty. I love Marlena's face. So like, it's that look, right? Like, no, thank you, right? But what if you eat a cookie without it or bread without it? Then you're missing that. And so I think going from the toxic positivity into a growth mindset means that we allow for those bitterness moments and the sadness and things that we may not like all the time.
Yeah, I see it as not accepting where you are. I mean, only you can know if you're experiencing the sadness or the anger from something that's happened. Not being in touch with your feelings makes them just come out sideways. So it is you can't be where you really aren't, and actually acknowledging. We talk about this in dialectical behavior therapy, that acknowledging that your hair is on fire is actually going to help you put it out. Like, so acknowledge the, okay, the house is burning down. So now we can bring the hoses instead of saying like, it's fine. I have my heirlooms with, it's fine. It's like, it's not fine. But if you acknowledge that it's not fine, you can move on quicker.
Yeah, I think of the human experience as being this mess. Like you have that positive stuff that might be intertwined, but if you ignore the hardship, the hard feelings, the part that needs to be cleaned up, then you never get to that growth, and that's a human experience of all of the emotions mixed up in an experience and having to sort through.
Yeah. Wow, really great discussion. Any other comments on that? I was gonna move on to the next question. Okay, now that we know that you can go into toxic positivity, kind of ignoring the fact that something is awful and trying to feel better about it too quickly when you're not actually ready, how can you then, acknowledging that you're not there yet, how can you sort of embrace where you are and just embrace that this is a process and not an event? Yeah, how do you go about embracing the opportunity for growth without ignoring that it really sucked?
Well, I'm a big fan of complaining. I know a lot of people don't allow, raise their kids to not complain. And my kids are allowed to complain anytime. The difference is that complaining doesn't mean that someone's going to come in and change something or rescue them. So maybe that just is my verbal processing and using words, but I'm a big fan of that. If you need to complain, complain. That's letting that out in one of the many ways that you can let that out.
And Sherry, really quick to follow up on that. How do you though make sure that you don't stay in that spot? Because I know that in a lot of like trauma processing groups, sometimes if they start talking about it, they just loop with it. And then you know that they're in the trauma cycle when they can't get off the dime with it. So how do you make sure that it stays relegated to a sliver of complaining and not just wallowing?
Well, I do think this is a difference between maybe everyday stuff and trauma, that trauma changes the structures in your brain. And so that experience is probably different. That verbal processing, if you're not doing something that then shifts that brain structure, then you're going to get stuck in that loop.
Yeah.
Just listen to that though. Look at what we just said here is that idea that complaining is okay. Taking a loop around to work something out is okay. It's we acknowledge our feelings. We acknowledge that this hurt, this sucked, I'm sad, right? Whatever it may be. And we need somebody with us. And as therapists and coaches, I think this is where a lot of us really excel, because we want to hold on to that. And, you let that person emote through it, right? I see you. I see your pain. We do that with our kids, right? Like, that boo-boo hurts, right? Yeah, your
My
knee
hair
is
really
skin.
is on
It's
fire.
yeah, right, exactly.
Right?
Do we need to process something about hair being on fire? But there's this idea now. Notice, but as we loop, right? What happens if we find ourselves going through that same sequence again with the same thing, and we're stuck in it, right? And then we're doing it again. So now we're just repeating this, and we're reliving it. So now we have growth opportunities of noticing we've just passed that same mile marker 3 times. We're not getting anywhere right now,
Mhm.
right? So what can we do? What can we do to start to change our path? And it may be subtle. It may, it may be trying to incorporate other things, some actual positivity, not
Mhm.
just toxic, but actual, like, okay, but we do have these things going on. We have these strengths. We have these opportunities. Let's try to take these.
Well,
Um,
using that analogy, the moving through, what is the context that this is happening? What are the triggers? What are the thoughts that you're having that are reinforcing this same cycle going forth? What are the emotions that you're not processing, that you're allowing them to process themselves? Like, if you don't process those feelings, they're going to do it themselves. And that's when it comes out in those negative or toxic or harmful ways of processing them. So
Which could look like, just can you say what that could be? Like, I think about like lashing out on a loved one could be a way that feeling doesn't get processed properly.
yeah, I think there's 3 pots of processing. You've got the toxic ones, and those are self-harm and drugs and alcohol and shopping addiction and blasting those emotions out on someone else. That is all processing emotions, even if it hurts yourself and other people. And then we have the positive pot of processing, which are much more intentional. They make you stronger, more confident, and healthier. And they move you through those feelings and you turn them into something else, or you release them. But then in the middle, we have this murky bunch of processing tools that also are numbing strategies. And those are things like watching TV. Watching TV can be a great way to get that distraction and disconnect. But if you watch TV all night and you get to the end of the evening and you haven't learned anything, you haven't engaged with anything, you've just numbed, then you're just really postponing that reaction. You're postponing that processing. And we do that with social media, we do that with games, we do that with TV and movies. Um, that those can be positive, but we often don't use them in a positive way.
Mhm.
yeah, absolutely.
I think we're finding maybe perhaps I'd like to explore perhaps in another episode. I think we're finding this how do we process emotions in a way that's super, healthy, because this kind of goes with it's hard to get to post-traumatic growth if we keep looping, as Matthew said, if we just keep in the loop. And yes, as therapists and coaches, we can help people break the cycle. I love EMDR for that. That's why I do EMDR, is because it helps rewire the brain. So does meditation. There's lots of ways to help break that cycle. Some are quicker than others. And some we are ready for and some we are not. There was a time in my life where if you had asked me to sit still for 15 minutes, I would have said, F you. Like, I don't have time for that. I just was not in the space to do that sort of thing. But would you like to share some quick little tips that you all have used perhaps in your own life or with clients that helped kind of break the loop, and we can discuss more of it in another episode?
I really like music when it comes to this. To me, especially as a sensitive, music always has a special place in my heart, and and being able to control that, right? So sometimes it's allowing the songs to emote, and just be able to have a good cry. Sometimes it's the anger, work it out, and just jam it. One of my favorite ones on this, and I'm just going to continue my weirdness, if that's okay, but because of all of the folk pop singers that play the hurdy-gurdy, one of my favorites is a lady by the name of Patty Gurdy out of Germany. and I caught on to her stuff during the pandemic, and she had this one song. It's called One by One. And the chorus is one by one, you got to sow in ashes, grow and behold. Storm and sun are taking care. So one day the blossom unfolds. And it's just this beautiful, and it's got a great choral rendition by Hell Score behind it. So it's a beautiful song, but the sentiment is this idea that we let go of things, that we have trauma and stress, and we can acknowledge it. And Patty is also very outspoken, particularly for men's mental health too. So people like that always just gold star in my book. But I think finding those like music that's meaningful for us can be super key to growth, because it reinforces the verbal side of us, but it also, I think, slips into the subconscious by allowing music to go in there, so it engages our emotions as well. And when you have those things balanced out, and again, if I go back to the gym method, this is lifting weights with both arms, so I can have more strength and more growth that way.
That's great. Those are great suggestions.
Mhm.
For me, so I have lists of ways of processing emotions just that I use in my work. And one of them has always stood out to me. It is go and chop wood. Now, I don't go chop wood, but there is something so physical about that activity. And I think getting moving, like working that out physically, that really allows you to release those emotions. The other way, though, is to feel seen and heard.
Mm.
Now, in order to have that, you have to have a connection with someone.
Mm.
You can't just go talk to someone in the grocery store line and feel seen and heard when you have no connection with them. So finding that person who can really sit with you and understand what you went through and hear that and see that, that can really break that cycle.
Wow, this has been such a great list. I just want to remind our listeners, like we've talked about being seen and heard. We've talked about music and art and poetry. We've talked about, Sherry, was that other one? I almost
Chopping wood.
Chopping wood, moving your body. Yeah,
Yeah.
physical, because as my yoga instructor used to say, like the issues are in your tissues and they got to be worked out. Meditation and EMDR, there are so many ways for us to healthily process emotions. And I know that there's no like set positive things we can guarantee what will happen after post-traumatic growth, because it's so individual, right? In sharing your work, you'll see couples become more intimate and closer and their bond stronger. Perhaps with misfits, you might see them really own their uniqueness. In my work, they may start actually attracting in healthier partners. Like there's a whole wide range of benefits that could happen when you really embrace and get to post-traumatic growth.
A lot of times it's hard to see that growth until you're out of it.
Right.
It's really hard to understand what happened and why it happened and how you're going to benefit from that until you have some distance from it.
And it's really helpful to have that coach or therapist like witness it and be like, wow, look how far you've come since when we first started meeting. And it's so helpful to have someone witness your growth. So as always, we appreciated everyone listening today. Please like, share, and subscribe, or hit that notification bell. And please comment. We would love to hear back from all of you and what you'd like to hear. And if you have any, comments on this particular episode. As a reminder, how can people find you if they'd like to work with you or access some of your resources? Sherry?
I'm at sherrytimko.com. You also can find me on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok.
Nice. Thanks, Sherry.
Always
Matthew?
good to have good content on there. I'm at Misfit Refuge is probably the best place to find me, and that's my social handles as well. So I'm around there.
And you can find me at coachmarlena.com and Coach Marlena and all the socials. And any quick takeaways before we end today's episode that you'd like our listeners to really know and take home with them?
Allow yourself to define your own experience. You'll have a lot of advice from other people, but allow yourself to like sit and make sense of and define the experience in a way that is useful or helpful to you.
Definitely. I like that. Maybe on that same piggybacking on that is find your strengths and embrace those, keep them in front of you. whether it's on Post-its or just mentally remind yourself what you do well and what you can do to get through your tough times.
I like both of those. Thank you. And I would say, the phrase, this too shall pass, and return to basics for self-care. Am I showering? Am I eating? Am I sleeping when going through a hard time? And that will definitely help you get to a growth spot instead of more spiraling. Anyway, thank you both, and we'll see you all next week for next week's episode.